everyone, I'm Jason and I'll be presenting my project for CS498. So the problem that I'm trying to solve is that math and theoretical computer science courses often require students to write precise English statements, for example, when they're describing an algorithm. And currently, I believe students don't get enough practice with it and receive feedback too slow. And it would be helpful if there's a way to give students automated feedback. So here's an example question from CS374. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the gist of it is that it's about minimizing the cost of the hotels you stay at while you're on a road trip. And here's a recursive formula that you can use to solve the problem. You may be wondering, am I going to try to explain this to you right now? Well, no, I'm not, because this formula is not supposed to make any sense on its own. It doesn't make any sense without providing a description of what the function min cost actually does. So that's why writing this description is such an important step of the problem solving process. So here's an example description that you could write. Define min cost ij to be the minimum possible cost of traveling from hotel 1 to hotel I under the constraint that the number of coupons used is at most j. So that's the skill that my tool is trying to teach, is being able to write a precise English description such as this one. And students often struggle with this when they start. They might write something like define min cost ij to be the answer for I and j, which is obviously not sufficient for including in an algorithm description. So now that we've described what the issue is and why we care about it, let's move on to how is my prototype solving it. So one question that might first pop up to mind is, we're essentially letting students input any statements in English, so how do we handle arbitrary English inputted by the student? Well, the short answer is we don't. So consider these two statements that a student might submit. They basically mean the same thing, but they use different phrases and different sentence structure to convey the same ideas. So for an automated system, it's hard to tell that they mean the same thing. So the solution is to define a context-free grammar. The instructor defines a context-free grammar that restricts the sentence structure and phrases that the student is allowed to use when expressing their ideas. So how do students actually interact with the system? It wouldn't be very user-friendly to just provide a student with a CFG and say, you have to submit something that follows this. So instead, we show a list of possible next tokens which are allowed by the grammar, and the student just has to type something that's from the allowed list. To show an example, currently I filled in part of a sentence, and here's a list of the possible next tokens which are allowed. So maybe I'll try putting in answer, and then when I put that in, it gets appended to my response here, and then the list of possible next tokens updates to the next tokens which are allowed by the context-free grammar. So just to finish this, maybe I would say for I and j. You may recognize this as the suboptimal student submission I showed earlier. So if we tried submitting this, you can see that we'll get feedback down here. Please be more precise about what quantity the subproblem actually outputs, and answer is too vague, which makes sense as feedback. So show that the learner types a token and updates, and then the learner can submit and receive feedback. And then once the student receives feedback, they can revise their sentence based on that feedback by deleting some tokens, and then backtracking and then putting in something new. So how is this feedback actually generated? Well, by constraint-based modeling, and each constraint has some feedback associated with it. So here are some example constraints. One constraint is that the description submitted by the student has to state explicitly what quantity the function outputs. So you can see that's what went wrong in this example, is I just used a vague phrase like answer and didn't say what the subproblem is actually outputting. So that triggered that constraint and resulted in this feedback. So to fix this issue, I might replace that with cost instead, and then say cost of traveling from hotel So I might try submitting this again, and that would actually trigger the next example constraint, which is that the description must explain how the function parameters affect the output of the function. So by that, what I mean is that j is one of the function parameters, but nothing in the description is explaining how j affects the output of this function. So that's what the feedback says. Your function declaration includes the parameter j, but doesn't explain how j affects the output of the function. So just to show happens on a correct submission, I'll finish typing this. And then submit, and then it'll say, good job. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation, so thank you for listening.